The morning of September 21st, 1939, dawned cold and grey over Warsaw. Just 3 weeks had passed since German forces had crossed into Poland, unleashing a war that would consume the world. The ancient capital, home to over 1 million souls, was now under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. But the true horror was only beginning. In the days that followed, something sinister began to unfold in the streets of Warsaw. Politicians vanished from their homes in the dead of night. University professors disappeared between lectures. Artists, journalists, Catholic priests, all were being swept up in a calculated wave of arrests. The Nazis called it maintaining order. History would recognize it for what it truly was: the systematic decapitation of an entire nation. These prisoners, Poland's finest minds, its bravest leaders, its most prominent citizens, were herded into overcrowded cells in Warsaw's notorious prisons. They were told they would be transferred to other facilities. Some were even given extra rations for the journey, handed back their personal documents, allowed to pack their belongings. It seemed almost routine, but the trucks carrying them out of the city were not heading toward any prison. Their destination lay 30 kilometers to the northwest, hidden deep within an ancient forest, near a small, unremarkable village called Palmiry. And in that forest, freshly dug pits waited in the shadows of the pines. What happened there between 1939 and 1941 would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed on Polish soil. More than 1,700 men and women, the heart and soul of the Polish nation, would be lined up at the edge of those graves, shot in the back of the head and buried in the cold earth. This is the story of the Palmiry Massacre and of the perpetrators who believed they could escape justice. To understand why Palmiry happened, we must first understand what Warsaw represented to the Nazi regime. This was no ordinary city in their eyes. Warsaw stood as a beacon of Polish identity, culture, and resistance. Everything the Third Reich sought to extinguish. Within its ancient walls resided more than 900 educational institutions, from elementary schools to prestigious universities. Nearly 200 museums, libraries, archives, theatres and cinemas enriched its cultural landscape. Over 900 houses of worship, Catholic churches, synagogues, Protestant temples, served a diverse population of faith. The city published more than half of all newspapers circulated throughout the entire country. 40% of Poland's university professors and students called Warsaw home. This was not merely Poland's capital, it was the nation's intellectual engine, its cultural beating heart, the very embodiment of Polish civilization itself, and the Nazis knew it. When German forces invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, they set in motion a plan far more sinister than simple military conquest. The invasion was merely the first step. What followed was nothing less than an attempt at cultural genocide, the complete erasure of Polish national identity. Warsaw, with its concentration of intellectuals, artists, clergy and leaders, represented the greatest obstacle to this twisted vision. After nearly a month of brutal bombardment and siege warfare that reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, Warsaw surrendered on September 28, 1939. The city was immediately stripped of its status as Poland's capital and downgraded to a mere provincial centre within the newly established general government, a German-occupied territory that would become a laboratory for Nazi racial policies. But demotion on paper could not diminish Warsaw's true significance. Almost immediately, the city transformed into the nerve centre of Polish resistance. The Polish underground state, one of the largest resistance movements in occupied Europe, established its headquarters there. Secret newspapers rolled off clandestine presses. Underground schools continued educating Polish youth, and armed resistance groups began planning operations against the occupiers. Years later, in December 1943, Hans Frank, the brutal Governor-General of occupied Poland, would write words that revealed the truth about Nazi failures in Warsaw. In his personal diary, he confessed, There is one place in this country which is a source of all our misfortunes. It is Warsaw. Without Warsaw, we would not have 4/5 of the trouble we are facing now. Warsaw is the focus of all disturbances, the place from which discontent spreads through the whole country. His words betrayed both fear and fury. Despite years of occupation, despite the terror, despite the mass arrests and executions, Warsaw refused to be broken. But Frank's admission came later. In the autumn of 1939, the Nazis still believed they could crush Polish resistance before it even began. Their method was as simple as it was brutal: eliminate the leadership class, and the rest of the population would become a passive, leaderless mass, suitable only for slave labor. The machinery of repression moved swiftly. Just 3 days after Warsaw's surrender, on October 1st, 1939, SS Brigadeführer Lothar Beutel marched into the city at the head of Einsatzgruppe 4, one of the Nazi mobile death squads that followed the Wehrmacht like vultures trailing an army. These units had a specific mission, refined and practiced during the invasion. They were not combat troops. They were executioners, tasked with eliminating anyone the Reich deemed dangerous: political leaders, intellectuals, community organizers, clergy, anyone with the education, influence, or courage to inspire resistance. Within hours, the raids began. German soldiers and Gestapo agents stormed through the city, kicking down doors, searching both public buildings and private homes. They carried prepared lists of names: teachers, professors, journalists, politicians, priests. The Nazi intelligence apparatus had done its homework well. On October 8, 1939, the terror reached a new scale. In a single coordinated operation, 354 Polish teachers and Catholic priests were arrested throughout the city. The official charge was harboring Polish chauvinism, which essentially meant being proud of one's Polish identity. In Nazi ideology, this alone constituted a crime worthy of death. The victims were dragged to Warsaw's growing constellation of detention facilities. Palmiry Prison, a grim fortress in the heart of the city, quickly became synonymous with torture and death. Mokotów Prison swelled beyond capacity. The central detention centre on Daniłowyczowska Street overflowed with prisoners sleeping standing up, packed so tightly they could barely breathe. Perhaps most feared of all was the building at 25 Sucha Avenue, Gestapo headquarters, where screams echoed from the interrogation chambers at all hours. Many prisoners never left these walls alive. Others were shipped to concentration camps in Germany, where they disappeared into the Nazi camp system. But for hundreds of others, a different fate awaited. In those early months of occupation, the Nazis chose an execution site that seemed almost theatrical in its symbolism. Behind the Polish Parliament building lay a walled garden, hidden from public view. Here, in the shadow of Poland's democratic heart, political prisoners were taken in the dead of night and shot. Between October 1939 and April 1940, several hundred people were murdered in that garden. But this arrangement couldn't last. Warsaw was too densely populated, too watched by too many eyes. Rumours spread. The underground press began reporting the killings. Witnesses saw blood-stained earth, heard the crack of gunfire in the night. The Nazis needed something more remote, more secure, more secret. They found it in the Campinos forest, 30 kilometres northwest of Warsaw, near the quiet village of Palmiry. The location was almost perfect for their purposes. The forest was dense, ancient, and isolated. Few people had reason to venture deep into its interior. A small clearing could be accessed by narrow dirt roads, easily blocked and patrolled. Local forestry workers could be sent home on execution days, and the sandy soil was easy to dig. Most importantly, it was far enough from Warsaw that the gunfire wouldn't be heard in the city, yet close enough that transport trucks could make the journey quickly before prisoners realized where they were being taken. From the spring of 1940 onward, Palmiry became the primary execution site for political prisoners from Warsaw, and the killings there were carried out with a precision that revealed careful planning and bureaucratic efficiency, the banality of evil made manifest. The executions at Palmiry followed a chillingly systematic procedure, refined through repetition into a grotesque routine. The killers themselves came from specific units. Members of the Order Police, regular German police forces pressed into service as executioners, formed the core of the firing squads. They were reinforced by soldiers from the 1st SS Totenkopfverbände cavalry regiment, stationed in Warsaw. These death's head units had been specially trained for such work. Overseeing it all were officers of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, under the command of SS Standartenführer Josef Meisinger, a man who would earn the nickname the Butcher of Warsaw. The preparations began before the victims even arrived. Graves were dug in advance, often by members of the Reich Labour Service or young men from the Hitler Youth, teenagers indoctrinated into serving the regime's darkest purposes. These pits could stretch over 30 metres in length and plunge nearly 3 metres deep, though smaller, irregular graves were also prepared for executions of smaller groups. On execution days, an eerie quiet fell over the forest. Local forestry workers were ordered to stay away, given a day off that none dared refuse. German police established a perimeter around the entire area, ensuring no witnesses could approach. The clearing itself was gradually expanded to accommodate more and more graves, the forest giving way to a killing field. The condemned were transported from Palmiry prison under carefully maintained deception. They were told they were being transferred to another prison, or perhaps sent to a concentration camp. Not pleasant destinations, certainly, but ones that held at least the possibility of survival. To maintain this illusion, prisoners were allowed to pack personal belongings. Sometimes they were even given extra food rations for the journey. Their documents returned to them as if they were merely being relocated. In the early months, this deception worked with terrible effectiveness. Many victims didn't realize their true fate until the trucks turned off the main road toward the forest, or until they saw the freshly dug pits waiting in the clearing. But deception could only last so long. As word of Palmiry spread through the prison network and into the city itself, some prisoners understood what awaited them. During later transports, desperate men and women tried to throw letters or personal items from the trucks, final messages to their families, evidence of where they had gone. After the war, during exhumations, some bodies were found clutching notes they had scribbled in their final moments. Executed in Palmiry. At the site itself, the victims' bags and belongings were confiscated, though occasionally they were allowed to keep documents or small personal items, evidence that would later help identify their remains. Jewish prisoners still wore the yellow Star of David that the Nazis forced them to display. Some bodies were later found still wearing Red Cross badges from Palmiryk's prison infirmary. The final minutes were orchestrated with cruel efficiency. Some prisoners had their hands bound, their eyes blindfolded. They were lined up at the edge of the grave, their backs to the executioners. Machine guns were the weapon of choice. Quick, efficient, capable of killing multiple victims in seconds. In some cases, victims were forced to hold a pole or ladder horizontally behind their backs as they stood at the grave's edge. This ensured that when they were shot, their bodies would fall in an even layer into the pit below, making it easier to cover them with earth. Post-war forensic investigations would reveal an even more horrifying detail. Some of the wounded, not yet dead, were buried alive, suffocating under the weight of earth and bodies. After each execution, the Nazis attempted to erase all evidence of their crimes. Graves were filled in, the disturbed earth carefully smoothed over. Moss and pine needles were scattered across the surface. Young pine saplings were planted on top, meant to grow and eventually make the graves indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. In Warsaw, families of the disappeared received official notifications that their loved ones had died of natural causes while in detention, or sometimes that they had been sent to work camps in Germany. No bodies were returned, no funerals were permitted. The dead simply vanished into bureaucratic language and official lies, but perfect secrecy proved impossible. The forest had eyes. Local residents, especially forestry workers who knew every path and clearing in the Campinos woods, witnessed things the Germans couldn't entirely hide. They saw the convoys of trucks arriving, heard the rattle of machine gun fire echoing through the trees, noticed the freshly disturbed earth and newly planted trees. Among these witnesses was Adam Habanski, a Polish forester who worked in the Campinos forest. Along with his colleagues, Habanski made an extraordinarily brave decision. At enormous personal risk, discovery would have meant immediate execution. They began secretly marking the locations of mass graves, creating maps and keeping careful records. This information was passed to the Polish underground resistance. Couriers carried reports to the secret headquarters of the underground state. From there, the truth about Palmiry spread. Underground newspapers published accounts of the massacres. Polish intelligence operatives worked to document every detail. In a stunning intelligence coup, resistance members even managed to steal several photographs that had been taken by German executioners themselves. These shocking images were eventually smuggled all the way to the Polish government in exile in London, providing irrefutable proof of Nazi crimes. The name Palmiry began to appear more and more frequently in underground publications. It became a watchword, a warning, a rallying cry. The Nazis' secret killing ground was secret no more. Of all the executions carried out at Palmiry, one stands out for its scale and the prominence of its victims. Over 2 days in June 1940, the Nazis perpetrated what would become known as the Great Palmiry Massacre. On June 20th and 21st, 3 separate transports arrived at the forest clearing from Pawiak prison. In total, 358 prisoners were brought to their deaths. This was not a random selection of victims. This was a deliberate strike at the very pinnacle of Polish society, a calculated attempt to behead the nation in a single blow. Among the condemned stood Maciej Rataj, the former Speaker of the Sejm, the lower house of the Polish Parliament, a man who had helped guide Poland through the difficult years after independence. Beside him walked Mieczysław Niedziałkowski, a prominent socialist activist and member of Parliament. Several other parliamentarians shared their fate, including Halina Jaroszewiczowa, one of the few women to serve in the Polish legislature. The list read like a directory of Poland's elite. Ludomir Skorowicz, a district governor, Jan Bełczykowski, a respected intellectual and writer, lawyers who had defended the innocent, journalists who had reported the truth, artists who had celebrated Polish culture, industrialists who had built Poland's economy. One victim stood out to the public imagination. Janusz Kusociński, Poland's celebrated Olympic champion. In 1932, he had won gold in the 10,000-meter race at the Los Angeles Olympics, bringing glory to his nation. Now, 8 years later, he was shot in a forest clearing like a common criminal, murdered simply for being Polish and prominent. The massacre particularly targeted women. 82 women were executed during those 2 days alone. Intellectuals, activists, teachers, community leaders. The Nazis made no distinction based on gender when it came to eliminating Poland's leadership class. The scale of the loss was staggering, almost incomprehensible. In 2 days, the Nazis had murdered over 300 of Poland's most accomplished citizens, people who represented decades of education, leadership, and cultural achievement. It was a national catastrophe, a blow aimed at Poland's future as much as its present. This massacre was not random violence. It was part of a formal operation with a bureaucratic codename, the AB-Aktion, or Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, the Extraordinary Pacification Action. On July 23, 1940, Governor-General Hans Frank officially declared the AB-Aktion complete. In his view, the operation had achieved its goal, the elimination of Poland's intellectual and upper classes, the destruction of the Polish leadership class that might organize resistance. The Nazi definition of this intelligentsia was deliberately broad. It wasn't limited to those with university degrees or formal education. Instead, It encompassed anyone who commanded respect, wielded influence, or demonstrated leadership within their community. It included priests who guided their parishes, teachers who educated children, local organizers who brought communities together, business owners who employed others, artists who preserved culture, anyone who could inspire others or provide direction. This was genocide by decapitation. The Nazis believed that if they eliminated the educated elite and community leaders, the remaining population would become a passive, leaderless mass, suitable only as unskilled labor for the Reich. But Frank's official declaration meant little in practical terms. While the AB-Aktion may have formally ended in July 1940, the killings at Palmiry continued throughout the rest of that year and into 1941. The executions became somewhat less frequent, often involving smaller groups, but the purpose remained unchanged: terror, intimidation, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might inspire resistance. The last confirmed execution at Palmiry took place on July 17, 1941. Some details remain uncertain. Several transports of prisoners vanished without clear records, their fates never fully documented, but evidence strongly suggests that the summer of 1941 marked the end of Palmiry's use as an execution site. The reason for abandoning the site was ironically the failure of secrecy. By mid-1941, Palmiry was no longer secret. The underground press had exposed it. Reports had reached the Polish government in exile. The photographs smuggled to London had been shown to Allied officials. The name Palmiry had become synonymous with Nazi atrocity. For a killing ground to serve its purpose of terrorizing the population while maintaining deniability, it needs to be simultaneously feared and officially unacknowledged. Once Palmiry's secrets were fully exposed, it lost its usefulness to the Nazi regime. They would find other methods, other places, for their murders. When Soviet and Polish forces finally liberated Warsaw in January 1945, the Campinos forest still held its terrible secrets. But thanks to the courage of Adam Habansky and his fellow foresters, those secrets would not remain buried. Palmiry was among the very first Nazi crime scenes investigated by Polish authorities after the war. The careful maps and records maintained by the forestry workers guided forensic teams to the exact locations of the mass graves. Exhumations began. From the sandy soil of the forest, hundreds of bodies were carefully recovered. Many victims were still blindfolded, their hands still bound, silent testimony to their final moments. Personal items, documents, even final notes helped identify many of the dead, allowing families to finally learn the fate of loved ones who had vanished years before. Today, the Palmiry Cemetery and Museum preserve the memory of nearly 1,700 men and women murdered there between 1939 and 1941. The forest clearing has been transformed from a killing field into a place of remembrance, where visitors can pay their respects and confront the horror of what happened there. But what of the perpetrators? What of the men who organized these massacres, who drove the trucks, who pulled the triggers? Many escaped justice entirely. Some died during the war. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, their crimes unaccounted for. But for some of the most prominent figures in the Palmiry Massacre, justice, or revenge, eventually arrived. The first was SS Gruppenführer Paul Moder. As the SS and police leader in the Warsaw district from 1940 to 1941, he held formal command over the units carrying out the executions. He never stood trial. In February 1942, he was killed in combat on the Eastern Front, a bullet ending his life just as he had ended so many others. Ludwig Fischer, the governor of the Warsaw district who oversaw the entire terror campaign in the capital, survived the war. After Germany's defeat, he was arrested and brought before the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was sentenced to death and executed in March 1947, hanged in the city where he had once wielded absolute power. Joseph Meisinger, the butcher of Warsaw, met a similar fate. As commander of the German security police and SD in Warsaw from late 1939 to early 1941, he had played a direct and personal role in the AB-Aktion. He personally selected victims and supervised the transports that ended in the killing fields at Palmiry. After the war, he too faced the Supreme National Tribunal. Like Fisher, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 1947, he was hanged. The highest-ranking perpetrator to face justice was Hans Frank himself, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, the man who had written in his diary about Warsaw being the source of all his troubles. After Germany's surrender, Frank was captured by Allied forces and brought before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, one of the most significant war crimes trials in history. At Nuremberg, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Frank's crimes, including his own meticulously kept diaries. He was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role in the murder of millions of Poles and Jews in occupied Poland. The tribunal found him guilty on multiple counts. On October 16, 1946, Hans Frank was executed by hanging. The Palmiry Massacre was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign of terror and extermination that consumed Poland during 5 years of Nazi occupation. During those 5 years, approximately 6 million Polish citizens, nearly 1/5 of the pre-war population, were murdered. Among them were 3 million Polish Jews killed in the Holocaust, but also 3 million non-Jewish Poles targeted for destruction simply because they were Polish, because they were educated, because they could lead, because they could resist. Palmiry represents a particular kind of horror, the deliberate, bureaucratic, systematic murder of a nation's intellectual and cultural leadership. It was genocide by decapitation, an attempt not just to kill individuals, but to kill Polish identity itself, to reduce an entire nation to a leaderless, cultureless mass. But the Nazis failed. Warsaw continued to resist. The underground state continued to operate. Secret schools continued to educate Polish children. Underground presses continued to print newspapers. And when the war finally ended, Poland endured. The forest near Palmiry is quiet now. The mass graves have been properly marked. The victims have been laid to rest with dignity. A museum tells their stories. Their names are engraved on memorials. Families come to pay their respects, laying flowers on the graves of ancestors they never knew. The story of Palmiry reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance. It shows us what happens when hatred becomes policy, when prejudice becomes law, when murder becomes bureaucracy, and it challenges us to remember, not just to know what happened, but to understand why it must never happen again. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest historical documentaries. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring the untold stories of world history.